Alrighty. What is up, everybody? Welcome to the Wayfarers Christian Church Deep Dive podcast. I'm joined here today by we're back to the old crew. Everybody that you've seen. I've got our Connections Pastor, Jacob Dooley.
There you go. Hey, everybody.
Sorry, man. I blanked on your title there for a second.
You should have just put like adjectives before it, like illustrious, magnificent.
Our incredible, our cantankerous Connections Pastor. So we've also got Ashley Wakefield, everybody's fan favorite.
Hello.
And our teaching pastor, Noah Randolph.
Hi.
If this is your first time tuning into the Deep Dive podcast, what we've usually done on these podcasts is an opportunity for us to take deeper dives into the topics that we have been dealing with in our Sunday services. We took a little bit of a break for the holidays, but right before the holidays, we were spending this time doing deep dives on people's stories, specifically various members and people involved with us here at Wayfarers Christian Church. We were getting to do the deep dives on their backstories. It was part of our backstory series. It was really fun. I really enjoyed getting to hear a lot of people's stories. But then, like I said, we took a break for the holidays, and now we're back, and we are starting a new series here on the Deep Dive where we are doing deep dives specifically on our church's core values, on the different values that are central and most important to us as a church. If you're a member of Wayfarers and you didn't get a chance to do your backstory, don't worry. I kind of get the feeling we're going to come back to backstories at some point in the future, so do not feel offended if we skipped over your story.
That's a great title, Back to Back Stories.
Back to Backstories.
Well, now we got to do it.
I'm sure we'll find an opportunity to bring you guys back on, and hopefully, as we have more and more members, then that can just be a series that grows in general with what we're doing here on the Deep Dives. But we thought that it was important, especially here at the beginning of the year, to focus on these core values, these things that are the most important to the church for a variety of different reasons. I'll be super upfront with you guys. The main reason, and one of the funniest reasons that we are doing this, is because I sent our Jacob, our Connections pastor, sent him to a convention to kind of pitch a little bit about what we're doing at the church. He was going to maybe help do some fundraising for us and a few different things like that. He went to this convention. It's called ICOM, the International Conference on Missions. I sent him all of this like paperwork about what the church is doing. We had some brochures and all this kind of stuff. And one of the papers I sent him with included our core values. And the week later, after Jacob came back, he said, we need to talk about this, because he was like, I don't think anybody at the church knows any of these core values, myself included. He was like, I felt like I was like terrified. I think you said, Jacob, you like just hid that paper off to the side.
Well, you gave me a stack of them to give away or
Right.
to like talk with people. And so what I did is I just didn't take those papers out of the thing. I took one out to lay on the table. So if people wanted to look at it, they could. And I was hoping no one would ask me about it.
Because you were just thinking, I don't know much about what these core values are about, and I don't know how to explain them.
Yeah.
And I thought that was just a very real challenge and reality that we need to address kind of here at the church. If these are going to be core values, things that are important to us, then definitely one of our pastors should be able to explain them. And we would hope the members of our church would be able to as well. So this series is going to be a focus on just explaining what those core values are, explaining why they are so important to us as the church, and just being able to have kind of an open conversation about what those values mean for a church like us, maybe some areas where we've seen those values not be present in other churches. And like I said, really explain why they became so important to us specifically. But before we dive in, I think an important part of establishing these core values is hearing a little bit of the story of kind of how we came up with them, which I think is a cool thing that we also realized a lot of people here at the church have not heard. So it involves Noah. Most specifically, No, I didn't know if you wanted to just kind of give us the backstory on the core values.
Yeah, so I was a barista at Avenue Coffee for a bit, and kind of before I was even like a manager there, I was just kind of like part-time. And while I was really the night guy there, and one night I was most of my job there was to like close. And if people that are watching this know what closing a restaurant is like, it's basically you kick everybody out and then you spend another hour there basically taking care of everything that needs to be taken care of. And one of those things was sweeping. And generally during that time, I would listen to a Bible or, just kind of go through different books of the Bible, just because that was at a time in my life when I was really I had not listened to a lot of the prophetic books, and I was eating them up. It was the first time that I had read Jeremiah, Isaiah, and all these books. And so I was reading or listening to Jeremiah, and I was about halfway through, and I've only had these experiences with the book of Jeremiah. I don't know why, but when I was listening to Jeremiah, something, I don't even remember the chapter, but something that was said in there caused me to stop what I was doing and just take off my headphones. And I just had this huge burst of inspiration for a couple seconds. And I think I had been listening to a lot of different podcasts. I had been listening to a lot of different people and thinking about a lot of the things that had been taught to me at the Bible college. I was about in my third year at the Bible college. So a lot of the ideas that Chase was teaching me about were still in my head. And so it was all of these different things that I had experienced in different areas of my life in various different ways all came together. And they came together in these 6 words. And it spelled out that it was an acronym for Christ, was what these 6 words were. And it was care, humility, ritual, invitation, sanctity, and trust. And those words just kind of came and in that moment and kind of embodied a lot of the different ideas that I had been experiencing. And so I think I called you that night. I can't remember if I did or if I called you the next morning.
You had already come on. You were kind of working in a real part-time way with me and with what we were doing at Wayfarers. We were trying to really mold and decide exactly what the church was going to look like. Like Noah said, he was still working at Avenue. And you did. I think it was... must have been after a closing, so it was late at night, especially for me. I have no idea why I was still awake at the time. And you called me and you're just like, this is a weird thing to say, but you're like, I just had a very inspired experience where everything came together all at once, and I just think these are going to be what really represents the core of what we want to do with the church. And I remember you were like, it was a really weird experience. It just all came together quickly. You sat down and started writing, I think you said.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think you even sent me an email with all of them listed already.
I did.
And some just basic
outline stuff on it. Yeah.
Description on it. And we had been talking about it for a few weeks, if not months at this point already, talking about some of our hopes and desires for the church. And I remember feeling the same way whenever you sent me the list and I read them. I was like, man, this, I feel hits all of them. It in some way or another, maybe doesn't perfectly encapsulate everything, but it definitely hits all of the things that we particularly care about for this church plant that we were wanting to start. And so I remember being really excited about it too, and feeling like it was just really encapsulating and bringing together a lot of what that's about. But like I said, this is a moment me and Noah shared. We wrote these down. We posted them on the website. We talked through them and really tried to define them for ourselves a little bit. And then never talked about them again. And so we're going on a little over a year now that the church has been going on. We've done sermons. We've done podcasts. We've done different things at the church. And we realized this is probably a good time to bring everybody else in on what these core values are and why they are so important to us as the church. You mentioned them all a second ago there, and we're going to not do all of them in this episode. Don't worry.
No.
Today, our goal is to focus on just the first one of those and just really talk through what those core values mean for us. And again, I think the most important thing to start with is that the first letter of each of these spells out that acronym for Christ, and I think that is one of the most important things about it for us. We feel that Jesus encapsulates and fully represents a key component of each of these core values. And we, as Christians, followers of the way, wayfarers in a way, are people who want to emulate Jesus in those ways. So the very first one, the first core value that we're talking about today is care. Specifically.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to open it up to you guys. Where do you guys want to go with this? Where do you want to start?
Well, should we at least give a explanation of what we wrote first?
That's a good start.
I have the what you have on the website.
Okay. Yeah.
What we have on our wall up here. I have it pulled up on my phone right now. Cool. So what I was thinking is I would read that, and then we can start the conversation on where we are as a church, and then how we want to be a caring church.
Cool.
Yeah.
So with each core value, there is a scripture reference. For care, it is Luke 7, verse 22. I'm going to pull this closer because I'm blind. Then he told John's disciples, this is Jesus speaking, "Go back to John and tell him what you have seen and heard. The blind see, the lame walk, those with leprosy are cured, the deaf hear, the dead are raised to life, and the good news is being preached to the poor." And so that's the key verse for this core value. So then we have just a little explanation. We believe the good news was not just the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ, but also the restoration of the fatherless, the sick, the poor, and the abandoned. This good news was the arrival of the kingdom of heaven, and Jesus shows John the Baptist that through his care for the oppressed, he is the king of this kingdom. As a church of this new kingdom, we hope to care for the oppressed, the downtrodden, and the poor, and bring the kingdom of heaven to earth. Counseling, loving community, and authentic prayer are central to our care for our members.
Nice. Great place to start. And so I think the first thing to start is with that passage that was referenced here, and really explaining why that really encapsulates a lot of this for us.
Yeah.
And I think it's because if you've grown up in church, a lot of times the way people explain the gospel, when you try to say, what's the gospel? What's the good news? What's the good news about Jesus? People immediately jump to talking about we get to go to heaven, we get to have our sins forgiven, Jesus died on the cross, he atoned for our sins, and that's really good news, which is absolutely a component of the gospel. I'm not trying to say that that's not the gospel and that's not good news. It's really good news. I definitely appreciate being able to spend eternity with the Lord instead of the alternative. But I think that Noah masterfully picked this verse for a lot of reasons, but one of them is that this contextually, this verse is a time when John the Baptist is coming before Jesus because he is a little bit concerned, a little bit worried. He's like, I'm not sure. Are you actually the Messiah? Are you actually the one that we should be waiting for, or is there like somebody else coming? Are you just kind of like setting the table and then somebody else is coming? And I think it's obvious that John the Baptist is worried about this because he's facing his own death and execution that's coming up just on the horizon. I think he can see where this is going, and so he's worried. He's concerned. I want to make sure I'm giving my life for something that's worth it. And it's been so powerful to me that the way Jesus answers John the Baptist and his disciples is he says, obviously, you can. This is the Nick Griffin paraphrase. Obviously, he is the Messiah. Look at all of these examples, and he talks about the real reality of the fact that people have real needs, and that their needs are being met. The poor, the sick, the people who have real needs, their needs are being met. And Jesus says that when you see their needs met, that's your sign that this is the gospel. That that this is the good news, that he is the Messiah, that the kingdom of God has come. And so I think the real question we have to ask ourselves sometimes is, if you are in a context where people's needs are not being met, where people are not being cared for in a lot of ways, then I think Jesus would even say, I'm not sure that you're really preaching the gospel like you think you are. I know of a lot of people that would say, we just preach the gospel, just worry about preaching the gospel. But if people aren't being cared for, we got to ask ourselves, are we really preaching the good news of the kingdom of God, or are we not? And that was the big part that inspired a lot of this for us.
Yeah, and I think some of the background to how we arrived at that was you and I both read several books by N.T. Wright, who was a big proponent of looking at the gospel from the lens of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, not looking at the gospel through Paul, which he has argued for a long time that we've used Paul to kind of understand what the gospel is, and kind of forgotten that Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John have things to say about the gospel too. And one of his arguments that he makes is that Mark opens up with Jesus announcing the good news to everybody before his death even happened. Like, he's announcing the evangelion to all of these different people. And when you ask the question, well, what good news is he announcing to these people? And Mark, it has to be that same good news that John gets, is that the poor are going to be taken care of, the widows are going to be taken care of, and that's that kind of good news that he's come finally as the Messiah to care for these people. And I think that's kind of the big point.
The joke he says all the time in speeches he gives is that certain people almost have this attitude of like, Jesus was a really good teacher, but it's a shame he never got to preach the gospel because he hadn't died yet and hadn't atoned for our sins. So, we get Paul later on, and Paul gets to preach the gospel because the crucifixion has already happened. But we obviously believe Jesus was preaching the gospel.
Yeah. But I thought about when Jacob was reading the verse, one of the things that I thought about was kind of what you mentioned, Nick, about John the Baptist side of it, and how he also mentions that, I have to decrease so he can increase. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a big part of caring, is that when God is calling you to do ministry, whatever he's calling you to do, that you have to allow Christ to increase while you decrease. And that can be a very big thing, as I know that we've talked about in our ministry at my church, at the Young Adult Ministries, that sometimes there's a struggle with what you want to do versus what God is calling you to do, and how it can be very heavy, because it can be like a lot deeper than you expect it to go, or it could be a lot more burdensome, not because it's bad, but it's because you have to be the answer to somebody else's problem in a way that you didn't expect, and that may cause a lot of pain for you, but it's increasing somebody else. And at the end of the day, it's going to benefit you as well, but it can be overwhelming. It's kind of like if you think about Jacob wrestling with God in the middle of the night while his family is meeting Esau, and it's like that wrestle with God that you have about what you're being called to do. So.
Yeah. And that actually connects very closely to our second core value, but we'll talk about that next. I think a really good point you brought up here, though, is that a big component of care, and the fact that care is important, is that you have to care about other people besides yourself. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I think it's very easy to become, I got my own needs. I've got my own things I need. Yeah. I've got my own things that I'm trying to accomplish. You talked about sometimes we've got our own goals in mind. And I think a lot of churches can fall into this as well. We've got our own missions, our own things we're trying to do, our own Easter service that's got to get figured out, our own, and it becomes very easy to become focused on ourselves or on our own ministries or on our own goals or on our own missions. Yeah. And so for us, a big part of care is the fact that we want to place people, other people especially, other people and their needs kind of at the top and central in a lot of ways, in the same way that we feel we see Jesus doing that. I always see the example of Jesus always had like a mission. Like he was clearly trying to go to this city and do this. He had this in mind. He was trying to go here and there. But he was willing to let himself be sidetracked by people who had needs, like the disciples. These children come to Jesus, and the disciples try to be like, no, Jesus is like busy. He's got things he's got to do. And they try to push the kids aside, and Jesus said, no. let the
Yeah.
children come to me. And I think you can really see that aspect of Jesus's ministry there, and the fact that he notices other people, he notices their needs, and he cares about them, not just his own.
There are so many examples when Jesus is going somewhere and someone calls out to him, someone pulls on his robe, someone is doing something that distracts.
Yeah.
And if, as humans, we're like, well, we got to stay on mission. We got to stay on track. But so many times.
Yeah, because I think there was a verse in the Bible, and I wish I could remember, but it was one where Jesus and the disciples were actually trying to rest. And then there were some people that came to them in need, and it's like, well, we can't rest now. We have to go and help them. So it was like what they wanted to do, whatever rest they wanted to get, it was like that's not as important as trying to help someone else. So you kind of had to put it off to take care of a need, you know?
Yeah. Yeah. And as with any of these, there are all kinds of other issues surrounding these and connected to these. And so lots of times we're in dialogue with other people around us and other Christians. But this one in particular, I think for me, and we mentioned it in the description of it a little bit, but there is a real fear amongst, this may not be in you guys' experience, but in my experience in certain churches, there's this real fear between what a lot of people call like a social justice gospel or social work gospel, or this idea that you become only concerned about like feeding the hungry and helping the poor and helping people here on earth, and then you end up just helping, the most crass way of saying it, a lot of people say, is you end up just feeding a lot of people for a little bit longer before they just all end up in hell.
No.
Anyways.
Wow, I never heard of it.
And so people will try to say, I think in some ways there's been like an overcorrection where people are so scared of becoming that sort of a church that they decide we're just going to be about like theology and preaching and whatever, and we're not going to worry about helping people's needs that they may have.
I never. Oh, go ahead.
I've heard that argument several times, and even recently with so many nonprofits popping up. A lot of times those nonprofits are filling that role, that social justice role. And so churches are like, why should we do that? They're doing that. Well, let's preach the gospel and let them do all that work, the physical work.
Right. And, another thing some people might say is like, well, we've got welfare programs in our country that can help the poor. We've got healthcare nonprofits that can help people with their healthcare. Let them figure out that, and we don't have to do that work necessarily.
Which, as a historical note, welfare didn't happen until churches stopped doing that. Like, you can actually look back in history towards like before welfare was a thing during like the 1930s and things, and a lot of the way that people were helped in their communities before that time was through individual churches doing that kind of thing. And it wasn't until
the churches stopped doing that.
Churches stopped doing that that the government was like, well, we have to step in and do this now,
Yeah, because I've never heard of, I guess, the whole social justice idea aspect of it. Because I guess, we've had moments at our church where we've done things for the homeless, and there's like this thought in the back of my mind, like, should we have done more than just feed them or do this? Maybe we should have preached the gospel. But then I kind of also think that I don't know what that person's relationship with God, it's like maybe they had been praying for something, or maybe that was their answer. Maybe that was confirmation for them to make their own decision. Like if they were praying that God would see them, or praying for food, and then we were the answer or somebody else was the answer, maybe they were like, okay, God really does see me and I can, make that step. I don't know. And so it's always like, you always feel like you can do a little bit more. But as far as, like welfare or like nonprofits helping, I kind of wonder, just an argument against it, and I'm not pretending I know the system inside and out, but it's like, what if they can't get access to that? What if, some people are ignorant about certain things, and then you have some people that are excluded from that, some people who are favored more than others. It's like, how do you get access to that? Because it's not, if it was that simple, then people wouldn't be homeless and living on the street.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think ultimately the big point I'm getting at is that, it's not really an either or question.
Yeah.
Like a lot of
Yeah.
people give it, where it's like you can either preach the gospel or you can care for people's needs. I think what you can see from the example of Jesus' ministry, and I would say from the early church, is that the way you preach the gospel, one of the ways you preach the gospel, is to care for people's needs. Jesus is very direct with people about the things in their lives that they need to change, but that doesn't mean he's like, first, prove to me that you're actually like a real believer, and then I will heal your, whatever. He wants to see their faith and trust in him, and he does it for them. And then after he heals them, he often tells people, all right, go and sin no more.
Yeah.
Go and, whatever. He calls them to that life of following him, but he meets their needs wherever they're feeling it. And so the point I was making, too, about it being something you can see in the early church has been a big thing for me, too. If you read in the book of Acts, you can see that the church took this seriously. Like, there were people that were selling extra land that they had so that they could take that money and just give it to the church so that they could, like, feed the widows and the poor in their church. I was just reading the passage in Acts a few weeks ago about the disciples and how there are so many widows and orphans that need fed in that first church in Jerusalem that they're like, you guys need to pick some other people to do this work because we've got to dedicate ourselves to like prayer and the ministry of the word. But it's clear to that, but like there were so many people, you gotta like keep that in mind. There were so many people coming to that first church to have food and their needs met that the leaders had to be like, we've got to pick some other people to take over this job so that we can keep praying and ministering to the word. So it really was not an either or for them. It was central to what it meant to be the church, to care for people.
Well, and half the reason for one of Paul's missionary journeys wasn't really missionary. It was one of the Christians in Antioch had prophesied that there would be a famine in the land of Jerusalem and Judea, and there wasn't going to be enough food for anybody. And so Paul decides to take Silas and go collect money from different churches in the Gentile areas to then bring all that money back to Antioch so that they can then buy food for everybody in that area when that famine happens.
Yeah.
And so that's like the reason that like Corinthians, for instance, he's so angry at them because they don't really end up giving as much as
he like guilt trips them.
He guilt trips them. Like, because like the Thessalonians are way poorer and yet they gave a lot. And so he uses that as an example of them should be giving. So it's a very, that's not like a minor point in their history. That's like one of the major things that they were known for during that time.
A lot of us think of Paul as this missionary who's traveling all over the world to evangelize and preach the gospel. But he clearly says in his own letters that a big reason for this trip in particular was to raise money to help feed people back in Jerusalem who were going through famine. And so, again, my only point, these are just examples basically just to bring up that I think sometimes we have missed out in the real power that can be found when the church cares. I think that's part of why you saw the early church growing so much. People noticed that people could go here and get their needs met.
Yeah.
These people aren't like selfish and just self-absorbed in their own things. They're actually helping other people. And that is attractive, and that's a way to bring people in. And unfortunately, I would argue that because we have quit doing that, maybe because we're afraid of doing that, because we don't want to become watering down the gospel or something like that, like people might say, I think that we've actually seen ourselves have less of a witness with non-Christians. There is a couple of conversations I can distinctly remember when I worked at Avenue Coffee where that was the criticism that people brought up about why they didn't want to be involved in church. It was because like churches spend thousands of dollars on their lights and fog machines and their stage display and their cameras and their all that kind of stuff when there's people with real needs out there that aren't being met. And so sometimes I think we're shooting ourselves in the foot. We think we're just focusing on preaching the gospel, But because we don't care about people,
Yeah.
we can't preach the gospel effectively.
Yeah, it's like you have to feed their physical need and their spiritual needs. And I think even with trying to use the money to help people, like there's even pushback against that, because I know we've had conversations in my family specifically, and I know that you guys may have heard this too, but sometimes people get offended, because I know that we had a conversation in my family about how some people felt offended at the idea that, oh, if somebody needs something like food or someone's house is burned down, because we've had like a couple of church members whose, their house or their apartment just unfortunately like caught fire, and
Wow.
they're like, well,
Yeah.
why do we have to take up an offering for them? How come you just don't have money set aside for that? Why are you asking us for anything? And it's sort of like, that's a point, but then it's like, well, it's like the church has money that it has to spend on other things as well. So it's like this double-edged sword reverse. It's like we don't just use the money to help other people, like it has to be used to like pay bills or keep the lights on, keep the water, the air, and the heat running. So there's like a lot of different factors, which is why I do think it's good for churches to be honest about where the money is going. But even with that, there's always going to be some pushback to something, because someone's always going to find a problem,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And my experience has been that oddly, the less money you have, the more willing you are to give it away, oddly. And I think a lot of that has come down to the tendency, and this is just my experience, this might be different for y'all, and that's totally cool, but at least for me, it's been that you're not as materialistic, because you tend to value other things outside of that,
Yeah.
and you tend to see life and the happiness that it brings aside from money, since that's not something that you have a lot of, and you find joys in other things apart from that. And so when someone is in need, you have more of a propensity to give, because you're not really relying on it so much anyway, because it's just not in the forefront of what you think about, And so I think that's what I've found has been, I don't want to side rail this whole thing to just talk about money, because that's definitely not the whole focus of care, but it is a huge part, is that we're trying to take steps in this to focus on people that are poor and oppressed in that way. And that is a real way that happens both in America and in other countries, And I think about this a lot, because it does feel like I've always felt that the church could do more in response to those problems. And that's where I really want to put our focus, is that at least for Wayfarers, what I want is for us to care about those stories and to care about the people in those environments, and not just pretend they don't exist, And I think that's really what I think I want to focus on. Sorry.
And I think that's a really great place to start switching over from just, we've talked about the Bible, we've talked about in theory and in history why this is important. So I want to talk, before we get too far along and run out of time, what is Wayfarers doing to show care? We've talked about the theory, we've talked about why in Bible we think it's important. So what are we doing, and maybe what is something in the future we're hoping to do that we can maybe let people in on, or be just a little more aware that this is why we are doing this specific thing?
Right.
Yeah. And so another reason we've been wanting to do these podcasts is just because we're still in the early phases of what we're doing as a church. So a big part of what we're doing is just brainstorming how to fulfill these core values and how to make them a big part of what we're doing. So I would say I personally felt like this is one of those that we talk a lot about, but we haven't done a very good job of actually doing any things to fulfill it just yet. So some of this conversation is just going to be things we're hoping to do soon. And some of them are things that we have already kind of plans in place as to what we're wanting to do.
And I will go ahead and just throw in, if there's an area that people that are listening, if there's an area that you think we can fill needs and show care to people, let us know. We don't think of everything. So you may have an idea that we're like, we didn't think of that, but we can totally fill that need.
Definitely. So first thing we are trying to do to really emphasize this is that we, especially those of us that are in leadership, with the church are trying to make every effort to be available for people, whatever their needs might be. When we were brainstorming this in one of our pastoral meetings, Noah told us about some unfortunate experiences he's had in the past where like you can't ever talk to the pastor, or where you have to like schedule a meeting, or where you have to like jump through all these hoops to be able to get your needs met, to be able to receive the care that you need. And as much as possible, we really want the atmosphere of what we do here at Wayfarers to not have those barriers between, especially those of us who are on the pastoral team and the people at the church. So we've tried to really make ourselves available, tried to really make efforts to, as much as possible, hang out with people, talk through needs that you might have.
Y'all have a unique connection card, too, that I think y'all should plug about how it's not just like a typical card that asks for your information. It's got more to it than that. Yeah,
that's an example of something we're about to be launching here soon. We've, hopefully this Sunday, we're going to be able to launch it. It'll be just a new thing we're going to start doing for people who come to the church. And it's going to be a digital connections card. A lot of churches have connections cards. Sometimes it's like a physical little card that you like pull out of the back of the pew and or chair, probably not a pew. Pull out of the back and fill it out with your name and your contact info. And the church I used to intern at, if you like turned in the card, they gave you like a T-shirt or something like that. You know, and that's a big part of making that connection with a new church. We developed our own connections card that we're wanting to do. We're trying to do it as digitally, something people can fill out on their phones, give us information about them. But it's really just got one question on there. It's just got a place for them to put their name, best way for us to contact them, and then one very specific question, which is just like, what needs do you have that you want met? Let me actually pull it up so I can read the actual wording.
Yeah.
Cool. So here's what that online connection card says. There's a spot for your name, preferred method of communication, and then it says, we want to be a church that serves your needs. How can we best serve you? Select all that apply. And we give people some options here. 1, I'm looking for community, connecting with others and meaningful friendships. 2, I'm looking for resources to better myself, mental health, spiritual health, emotional health. 3, I'm looking to get my questions answered, theological, philosophical, political, biblical, whatever those questions might be. 4, I'm looking for a place to serve others, serving in the community and serving in the church. Or 4th, other. And the reason we worded it that way is just because that is so central to what we want to do here. We want to care for your needs, so we want you to tell us what do you need, you know? Do you have questions you want answered? Do you have needs that you need met? Are you looking to connect with people? Are you looking for friendship? Whatever it might be, because we really want that information from our members so that we can tailor what we are doing to make sure that when you come to Wayfarers, you feel that we care about you and that your needs are being met.
Yeah. Now, I will say personally, this is just my personal experience. I can't speak for everybody, but I do think that Wayfarers is really good with fellowship, just based on what I've experienced, like with you guys and some other people that I've met. And I do think that people underestimate how important that is, because we actually had a woman at our church who, and I never met her, I didn't know who she was, but she was new, and our pastor had said that, you know, it kind of made him a little upset because she left, and the reason that she left the church was because she felt like she couldn't make a friend. And so it's like, you don't know what people's needs are when they come through the door, because people are not just trying to connect with God, but they may be trying to connect with people, which is completely normal, because that's what we're supposed to do anyway. And so, you know, in some environments you can walk into it and there's, you know, not enough fellowship, because, you know, people have this thing with like, we don't know you. I already have people that I know, so I'm not going to waste my time trying to figure out who you are, if I can trust you, because it's a whole process. And so instead of taking the time and being patient enough to go through their process, I'm just going to stick with who I already know and just kind of let someone else fall by the wayside. And so it's like you kind of have to give that person what they need, even if it requires a process for you to go through that. So.
Yeah.
I'm glad you have felt that way. Like I said, we've been working on it. So I'm glad that you've felt that connection, because that is important to us.
That's 4 core values from now, though, Ashley. It's invitation. So Another podcast.
I'm just like getting into all the other like core values. I'm like, we're just going to talk about all of them
Well,
today.
and this is really good though, because they're all connected.
Right.
Yeah.
And they all feed into each other. And we really hope that altogether you get that kind of full version of what Jesus was about and what we want to be about.
Yeah.
Some ideas of some things we're working towards that we haven't done yet that we want to do that we think will really fit with this core value. One, we're going to start just giving a portion of our finances. We were talking about finances to other ministries and nonprofits and people that are doing good work in the city. We are in the process of determining what some of those organizations would be. So if you're listening to this or watching this and you have a good suggestion for us, hit us up. We want to, help out those people. Give us some suggestions where we can send money. We really want to, put our money where our mouth is in that sense. And it won't be a lot because we don't make a lot of money here. We're a small church, but the little bit of money that we do get, we want at least a portion of that to be going towards really meeting people's needs. And then the other two things we're really working on kind of go together, which is that what we've perceived a lot of people have needs for is needs for counseling and coaching and like mental health resources and just various different things. Talked to so many people who have needs in those areas. So we're working towards at the church here, making some connections with local counselors so that hopefully we can offer some counseling resources to people who are a part of what we're doing here at the church. And we have some ideas in mind of how we can even offer some in-house resources for counseling and helping work through some of those issues. So got all those irons in the fire. We're trying to make it happen, but the reason we want to bring all those things together is because we do want it to be really apparent. When you come to Wayfarers, people care about you, and you will have your needs met.
Yeah. Not to pull it away from the topic, but I've never heard that phrase, irons in a fire. What does that mean?
A lot of irons in the fire. When you are like blacksmithing, you've got like a whole bunch of different things that you got in the fire at the same time. And
okay.
They need to all stay hot. Like if you pull one out, it cools down and then you can't like melt it or connect it to the other thing. It's a similar version of the, like lots of spinning plates. A lot of people say they got a lot of plates spinning, I think is the phrase. I don't know what it is.
I've never heard that one either. Man, you're just like...
Tried to make it better, but just...
Yeah. That is, unless I'm using it incorrectly.
Irons in the fire. Huh.
Hey, we got time.
Are you
have
just
lots
like,
of irons in the fire.
Yeah.
Is to have several simultaneous activities or potential undertakings or opportunities.
Yeah.
Example here. I have a lot of irons in the fire at work right now. It's going to be tricky to balance all of them over the next few weeks. Answer, how's the job search going? No, the answer here could be no interviews yet, but I have a lot of irons in the fire. So
in the process of working towards a lot of different outcomes.
Yeah. Huh. All right. Well, there you go, listeners. If you're dumb like me and don't know what that is, there you go.
I don't know if I'd qualify you as dumb. But,
I think that's the last thing anybody would use to describe Noah as. But yeah, we've got a lot of things we're working on. Hopefully, many of those will come to fruition soon. And we can offer some of those resources for people who are here at the church.
And like we said, if you're listening to this and you're like, I didn't hear this one area that I think would be very good for us to fill, please reach out, let us know so we can consider and maybe throw that in the fire with everything else.
Another iron in the fire.
That should be the name of this episode.
So, one thing I'll jump back to conversation we were having at the beginning, and I think it's important to mention this. I want to key in on something you brought up, Ashley, where you said sometimes people will feel like why should I be helping people out? They should have just had some savings, or they should have It's not my fault that their life is going bad. Why should I feel like I have to help out with that?
And maybe we should talk about individualism a little bit in America and how
Absolutely.
we as a church are very anti that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That's actually where I was going with
Okay,
this.
yeah.
I think a big reason a lot of people feel that way is because, like Noah said, here in America, we're very like individualistic. The big phrase in America is "pull yourself up by your own bootstraps." You know, like I'm going to go out there. I'm going to make a name for myself. I'm going to save up my money. I'm going to make my resources. I'm going to do it all by myself. And we have a big savings account in case for a rainy day. We have insurance for every possible thing that could happen. We do all of these things, and the purpose of it for a lot of people is so that we don't have to rely on anybody else. That's our goal. It's like, I don't want to have to rely on any other person for my own needs to be met. And in America, that sounds like a good thing. Like, we're like, yeah, that's really great. You shouldn't have to rely on other people. I personally have been really convicted that that is not a good thing, not necessarily biblical, I would say, in a lot of ways. And in my own experience, though, there is a verse I can bring up that does lean that way a little bit. But I will say personally, from my own experience, that's not been the way that I've ever lived my life or was even brought up specifically.
Yeah, and as someone on the outside, I would say, Nick, you're like the most obvious example of someone that lives countercultural in this way. Like, you tend to give yourself to your family quite more than I would do to my family, and you tend to do a lot more for people around you, and you always have a community of people that are always doing things for you, and you're doing things for them, and it's never one man on an island kind of way. Whereas I would say I'm actually pretty awful at this, honestly. Like, I'm working on this, so don't look to me as the example here.
And I was gonna say that because Noah had brought up something earlier that reminded me of this, and then you bringing that up reminded me of. I had to do a study of the difference between the groups of the Essenes, the Pharisees, and the Sadducees. Yeah. And I was watching this video, and I don't remember his name or the website, but he gave like an interesting perspective of how, sometimes your socioeconomic status can have an effect on your beliefs. So it's like the Sadducees were wealthier. They were typically like high priests. So that had an effect on their mindset. Like, they were the ones who believed in free will. Yeah. And so it was like the idea that I worked hard for this. Like, I have this status and this money because I worked hard for it. And the Essenes were the poor group who didn't have as much money, who didn't have as a high title. So they were solely on predestination, how that has an effect on your certain beliefs, and how people who are poor, like, they don't claim that I'm poor because I wanted to be poor. It's just things happened in my life that I didn't always have control over. And so it kind of reminded me about how you brought up how people who are poor and have less are willing to give more, because it's like you kind of sympathize with the fact that there's certain things in my life that I've gone through that I didn't want to happen, and I sympathize that with you. And I'm not saying that all wealthy people think like this, because they don't, but it's like the idea that I worked hard for this, how come you can't work hard for this? Like, absolutely. I achieved all this, how come you can't get up and achieve something?
It's crazy. There's actually been studies that have shown exactly what you're talking about, which is that people who have had a lot more, so therefore they've had a lot more choices and a lot more power over their choices, are more likely to believe that they got there through their own effort. And people who have just constantly come up against barriers in their life are a lot more likely to realize, hey, man, sometimes things are just out of my control. I'm working as hard as I can, and I can't make it happen. And so I would put myself in that category of, like, this is a big thing that is important to me, but not because I definitely think that my upbringing was a big part of it. Like Noah was saying, I appreciate the compliment. I'm not sure that I even chose it. I think I just kind of fell into this because of my own experiences, which is that my dad and my whole extended family on grandparents' side, everybody, have always been in ministry work their whole lives. So they have never had like a job, a regular job, where you go and you work and you get paid in exchange for your work. Their salaries have always been dependent on, like, offering tithes, people being generous, and giving. Like, my entire life, we've been dependent on other people being generous. And that's been the way that I was brought up. That's been the way that I was raised, and that's been the way that like we've had all our needs met. The biggest example I give of this all the time is that my dad told me his very first car he ever bought was right when he graduated college. He bought like 80 something Honda Civic. He said it was a little egg-shaped car, got some ridiculous like 36 miles to the gallon in like the 80s, which is insane. But part of it's because it had a little tiny motorcycle engine and was a little bitty car. This was the last car that he ever bought. He sold it right before he went to the mission field to Uruguay, and every vehicle he's had since then was just given to him by somebody, whether in the church or somebody who supported the ministry or a friend, or it was a company car that belonged to the ministry or something like that. He's never had to like purchase another car. He bought that first car. Every other car has been like a gift. Some of them were a lot nicer than others. We've had all different variety of cars in those cars. But he was just very literally depending on other people for a vehicle, for how to get around, you know? And I know some people that would be like freaking out if that was the life they lived, you know? It's just like, I got to depend on someone to just give me something. Can I just go get a job and earn some money and, you know, buy my own vehicle? But I think that there is a very real value and kind of humility that comes from being dependent on other people for things like that. I've particularly used the example, there's a story in the Old Testament about, I guess it's in Daniel, and I believe it's King Nebuchadnezzar. Noah, Ashley, you guys can fill me in here if this is wrong. He is, the way I remember the story is the king he's on top of his castle, he's surveying his kingdom, and he's look at all of these amazing things that I have done. Look at how great this kingdom that I have built is. And as he's doing this, he is forgetting the fact that he was given a prophecy just relatively recently, before that, talking to him about the importance of like being humble and realizing that God is the source of all of that. He didn't just do it through his own strength, through his own power, through the mightiness of his own kingdom. And because he refuses to acknowledge God in this moment as he's surveying his kingdom, he goes crazy, and he goes out into the field and
eats grass.
And spends years, I think, right, just out like a crazy person out in the field eating grass. All kinds of theological meanings to that, which is for another podcast. But the sin of this king in this moment is that he thinks, I did this myself. Look at this amazing kingdom that I did myself. Look at how I brought it up myself. And he's not realizing that God is the source of it. And that's true for all human beings. All of us, no matter what you did, I guarantee you, as hard as you worked, as disciplined as you've been, God's the one that gave you the opportunity to have that, those things that you have. And we can forget that. One way to not forget that is to very literally depend on God to bring you those things through other people.
And I like the comment he makes after that. After God brings him back to a place of sanity, he says something along the lines of, God can humble whoever he wants to humble. And I was like,
Yeah. There's a famous passage in James where James is talking to Christians, to people in church, and he tells them, don't say, next week I'm going to go over to this town and do this business, or don't say I'm going to go over here. Rather, you should say, if the Lord wills, then I'm going to go and do this thing or that thing. And I think he's really challenging that tendency we have as humans to think that we did this all ourselves. And so for all of those reasons, I think being generous, being willing to help other people and meet their needs, and being willing to let other people help us, because maybe that's the harder thing we have as Christians, is being humble enough to be like, hey, yes, I need your help. Can you please help me with this thing? Is the attitude that God particularly wants us to have, rather than, judging people for not having enough savings or whatever it might be. We're kind of missing out on an opportunity there. My dad teaches a course here at Mid-South about fundraising for people who want to go out and raise money for their ministries. And one of the most perspective shifting things he said in that class is that he said, fundraising is not something you do so that you can do ministry. Fundraising is a ministry. He said a lot of people like to think that this is just like a check mark list. This is a wall I've got to get over so that I can go and do the ministry that I actually want to do. I've just got to suck it up and raise the money and ask some people to give me money and be real uncomfortable for a little bit, and that will be the way that I can fund my ministry and go and do the work that God's calling me to. And my dad really wants people to understand that generosity is essential for a Christian. If you're not generous, then you're missing out on a huge part of what God has called us to be. And all of the stuff I'm talking about, it really gets you to realize how much you depend on other people and on God himself through these other people to meet a lot of your needs. So he really thinks that it's like a work of ministry in a way, especially for really wealthy people. That's how he focuses it in his class a lot. A lot of these really, really wealthy people who are the ones that are more likely to be giving you money for your ministry are people who maybe have had that temptation, like the king, like people we're talking about, who to think, I'm good, I have enough money, I've done all this on my own, I'm fine by myself. And he says one of the best things you can do as a minister is teach them to be generous with that money and teach them the realities of the fact that no man is an island, and we all depend on each other all the time and on God ultimately for everything that we do. So for that reason, this core value of care is connected to that for me especially. It's a way of acknowledging the fact that we need each other and that we can't do this on our own. And that one of the things Jesus called us to do is to care for other people, and so kind of build that network of connections as a church.
Yeah. I think that's great, and I think that's a great place to end it.
Absolutely. Yeah. So next week, we are going to move on to the next core value, one of the core value of humility. Super excited about that one. Would love for you guys to tune into that. This next couple months here at Wayfarers, we are starting a series. I'm specifically focusing it on the Psalms and on what to do when it feels like people have let us down. Yep. How do you live your life when it feels like you've been let down by a lot of people? And I think the various Psalms really give us a way forward into that. So if you want to,
that's a good way to pitch it. Is like, what do you do when you do start to care and then it bites you? You know, that's a great way to.
Yes,
that's a great way to phrase that.
That's what we're focusing in on at Wayfarers. So we would love to see you guys on Sunday. Come hang out with us. 3097 Knight Road. We've changed our hours for the new year. We meet at 6:00 now, not at 7:00. Love to see all of you guys here with us. And I'm going to give you a teaser next month. Our Connections pastor, who I forgot his title here recently, he's going to be continuing that series on the Psalms with me as well. So if you want to hear him preach, and you got a whole month
to talk about.
You got a whole month to invite people. Yeah. I want a big old crowd here to make Jacob as nervous as possible whenever he's up there. But we would just love for you guys to be a part of it. So hope to see you then. Otherwise, we will see y'all next week for the deep dive.
See you later.
Bye-bye.
Bye.